Welcome to this WiseOwl tutorial on using Foreach loops and containers in SQL Server Integration Services, covering everything apart from file loops, which were covered in a previous tutorial. Here's what you'll learn in the tutorial. We'll begin by looking at the most common enumerator, ADO enumerators. We'll show what we're trying to do. We'll create an object variable to temporarily hold a set of rows. We'll then show how to loop over each row in that set, running some script for each row in turn, and then we'll test out the entire package to see if it's done what we thought it should. We'll then look at item enumerators, where you can store a set of rows in memory by typing it in, rather than using a SQL Server table. Then we'll look at ADO.NET schema row set enumerators, which is basically a fancy word for looping over all the rows in a schema in SQL Server. We'll look at how to create the looping container, and then how to process each row within the loop within script. And finally, we'll have an overview of looping over XML files using a node list enumerator, and show how to loop over all the nodes in the file. So let's get started. Before we begin this tutorial, let's look at what we're trying to actually achieve. I've got here a table called mentor numbers, and what it contains is a list of all of the mentors from the first 9 series of the X Factor series in the UK. Apologies to American and other viewers around the world. For anybody who's been watching other tutorials in this series, this will be familiar data. And what I want to do is find out which of the X Factor mentors has had the most proteges. The answer, of course, is Louis Walsh looking at the data, but we're going to write a package which will automatically loop over all of the records in turn, monitoring the number of proteges and storing which one is the largest number. If this all sounds like looping over record sets in VBA, that's because it is very similar, but in integration services it's called an ADO enumerator. So to get this to work, we're going to need to obviously create a package in integration services, which I've already done, and within that create a connection to our SQL Server database. And the next thing I'm going to do is to use an execute SQL task to read in the data from the mentor numbers table into something called an object variable, so that I can then enumerate all of the records within that variable. Before I can create my execute SQL task, what I need first is somewhere to put the data. And the place I'm going to put it is a variable, which will be a temporary holding place for a set of records. And the difficult thing about this variable is not creating it, but choosing what data type to give it. So I'm going to call it mentors, and the data type is actually should be record set, but there isn't such a data type, so I'm going to choose the vaguest thing I possibly can, which is object. And what will happen is integration services will allow me to put a set of rows inside that variable. So now that I've got that, I can create my execute SQL task to begin my package, and what it's going to do is to load the mentors into a variable, so that's exactly what I'll call it. If I then configure that by double clicking on it, the first thing I need to do is to say which connection it's using, and it's using the X Factor one. I then need to put in a SQL statement. Happily, I've got one in my clipboard. Is going to select all of the 3 columns from the mentor numbers table. And then what I need to do is to choose a record set to put that into. And what I'm going to do is export the entire set of data into my variable. Now that's all very well and good. That will create an entire record set, but where will it put it? To answer that question, I need to go to my results set tab on the left hand side and add in a new mapping. There could be several outputs from this execute SQL task. I'm going to take the first one, which, as in most things in integration services, is numbered from 0, so that is equivalent to the first set of rows returned from my execute SQL task. In fact, it's the only one. And the variable I'm going to store it in is the only one I've created so far, which is the one called mentors. So if I now choose OK to confirm that and run my package, I think I'll probably just need to change it and set that to be my start package first. What will happen when I run it is it will load up the data from the mentors table into an object variable. And for the moment, you're going to have to believe me that that's what's actually happening. What we now need to do is to loop over those records, doing something to each in turn. Before I can create my Foreach container to loop over the rows of my table, or rather my variable, I need somewhere to put the information. So what I'm going to do is create no less than 5 variables. The first 3 variables are all going to hold columns of the current record in the ADO enumerator I'm looping over. So I'll call the first one a first name and make that into a string variable. I'll call the second one last name and make that also into a string variable. And the third one I'll call proteges, if I could spell it, and that's going to be an integer. It holds how many proteges each person has. The other 2 variables I'm going to create are going to be to keep track of which is the highest number of proteges at any point in time, and what's the name of the mentor who has that number of proteges. So I'll call the first one highest number, which will hold the highest number encountered so far, and the last one I'll call highest name, which will hold the name of the person who has that number. And these last 2 variables will be used in script and will keep changing as I come across a mentor who's had more proteges than any yet encountered. So having created those variables, what I can now do is to create a Foreach container, and what I'll do is feed the execute SQL task into that and give this a different name. So let's call this loop over mentors. And what this will do is read in each row one by one. So to configure it, I can double click on it, and the first thing I need to do is say, rather bizarrely, I have to go to the second tab to do this, what sort of a collection it is I'm looping over. Now there's a few here. There's for each file, which I covered in a previous tutorial, and I'm going to cover most of these in the current tutorial. So later on we'll look at for each item, and we'll look at for each node list, and we'll also look at for each for each schema. But what we're going to do for now is look at for each ADO enumerator, which will look at each record in turn. I then need to say which variable I'm going to use to get the information from. And I'm going to use my mentors variable, which, if you remember, contains a whole set of rows. What I can then do is create something called variable mappings. And what I'm going to do is say that the first variable, called first name, will take the value of the first column in the set of records. The last name column will contain the value in the second column. And finally, the proteges column will contain the value in the third column. So basically it's mapping the columns on one by one. If I then choose OK to confirm that, and if I run my package, what you should see again is success, but again you're going to have to trust me with this. What it's doing is looping through every single row in the underlying table in turn. Let's just have a look at that. It's reading Cheryl into the first name variable, Cole into the last name variable, and proteges into the proteges variable, then discarding all those values and going on to the next record, and doing that for each of the 9 records in turn until it's run out of rows, at which point it will finish. So what I now need to do is, within my for each container, actually do something with the information I'm gathering. So what I'm going to do now is to add a script task within my container. And what will happen is this will run for every single row in the underlying table which has been loaded into the object variable. What it's going to do is check for the highest number of proteges, and what I can now do is edit it to say how. Now I'm going to put 3 variables into this, which are equivalent to the 3 columns for this particular record. So if I click on that little icon, I'm going to pass in the first name, the last name, and also the number of proteges. And those will be read-only variables because the code only needs to check them. I'm also going to set 2 read-write variables, which are the highest name and the highest number, so that at any time in running through the code, those will always be set to the maximum number of proteges encountered so far and the name of the person corresponding to that. So I'll choose OK to confirm those 2 things, and now I can edit my script to say what it's going to do. Now at this point you could have had to sit watching me do a lot of typing, so I've taken the liberty of putting everything in the clipboard and pasting it in. Let's have a quick look at what that's doing. The first 3 lines of code are reading in the first name, last name and number proteges from variables passed in into variables within my C# script. What I'm then doing is also reading in what the current highest number is, and if I've come across a number for this particular mentor where the number of proteges is greater than the highest encountered so far, I replace the current highest number with a new one, and that's what this line of code does. I also store the name of that person by taking the first name and concatenating it with a space in the last name. So at any point I can be absolutely confident highest number holds the highest number of proteges encountered so far, and highest name holds the name of that person. So if I come out of that and choose OK to confirm it, I now just need to add a script task to the end, and I can then confirm that this is actually doing the correct thing. So what I can now do is add a script task to the bottom of my package and make sure that it is the last thing which runs. And what this is going to do is display the name of the busiest mentor. So I'll call it something very similar to that to say what it's going to do. I can then double click on that as always to configure it, and the script task is going to need to know 2 bits of information. The first one is the name of the mentor who's been the busiest, who's got the most proteges, and the second thing is how many proteges they had. If I then choose OK to confirm those 2 variables being passed in, I can then edit my script. And again, rather than having to watch me type things in, I've copied it into the clipboard, so I should just be able to paste it in there. So what it's going to do is read in the value of 2 variables, the name of the person and how many proteges they had, and then use a message box to display that information on screen. So it should say busiest mentor is Louis Walsh with 30 proteges. So let's see if it does. If I now come out of that and choose OK to confirm my script, what I should now be able to do is to run this. And I'm hoping I'll see a nice friendly message consisting of the information I built up in the C# script. So I can choose OK and stop debugging that, and that all seems to have worked. It's time now to have a look at some of the other containers and other for each loops you can use within integration services. The type of for each loop which is called an ADO enumerator, which I just covered, is probably the most useful in SSIS. But just for the sake of completion, this part of the tutorial will show 2 or 3 more. The first one I'm going to show is how to use loop over items. Now to do that, I can embed the data within the package. So what I'm going to do is I've taken a copy of my original package and I'm going to delete the execute SQL task. So rather than the information coming from an SQL Server table, what I'm going to do is configure my loop over mentors so that it does something slightly different. Instead of looping over the records in a SQL Server table, what it's going to do is loop over a set of items. And in order for that to work, I need to define what the items are here. I'm going to use exactly the same table just to make it easy to understand. So I'll have 3 columns, the first 2 being a string column and the last one being an integer. So if I choose OK to confirm that. And I'm now going to type in 3 potential mentors in the X factor. Perhaps these are for a future series. So I'll have Nigel Foreach, I'll have Adele Adkins, who I think would be a busy person, and I'll have Basil Brush, who tends to feature in a lot of my examples. If I then go to variable mappings, what I need to do, as I did before, is say that the first name variable maps onto the first column I've created, the last name to the second column, and the proteges to the third column. So in fact the only difference with what I've done is rather than refer to a SQL Server table externally, I've embedded that data within the actual task. If I then choose OK, just to show there's no trickery about this, I'll just make sure that that is my startup object. And if I now run that package, it should produce exactly the same result, although obviously with a different name and a different number of proteges. So using items is just an alternative to using SQL Server tables, but on balance I would argue probably less useful. We've looked now at how to loop over tables in SQL Server and also how to loop over items. What I'm now going to do is show how to loop over SQL Server schemas. You can see what's possible by typing this command in SQL Server. Select star from information_schema dot. And when you type in the dot, which I'll now do, you can see all the possible schemas you can list out and loop over. So what I'm going to do is loop over all the tables, and when I run that, you can see there's 4 rows, and what I'm going to do is store the 3rd column. So that'll be column number 2 from the point of view of integration services. I'm going to store that in a variable called table name, and then write out those tables to a text file. So let's see how this works. In integration services, I've already created a package called looping over schemas, and what I'm going to do is to add to that a Foreach loop. And what this is going to do is loop over tables. I'll configure that as always, and the sort of collection this is for each ado.net schema row set enumerator. And what that basically means is SSIS will create a table in its memory of all the records within the schema you've chosen, and then loop over all those rows. Now I need to create a connection, and this is where it gets a bit strange. I could have done this separately, but I'm going to create the connection from within this task. And I need to create a new connection, and the provider for this has to be this, a SQL native client. I'm sure Googling would tell you why, and I'm sure at one point I knew why, but for the moment, for me, it's enough to know that's what I need to use. My server name is that, and I can choose my database I'm connecting to as X-Factor, and then choose OK, and OK again. And the schema I'm going to import is all the tables from that database. So having set that up, I now need to create my variable mappings. I haven't had the foresight to create a variable called table name, so just for a way of contrast, what I'm going to do is create it on the fly by choosing to create a new variable at this point. I'll call my new variable table name. It's going to be a string variable, and I'll assign it to the 3rd column in the schema, which is column index number 2. So if I choose OK, that will automatically create a table in memory corresponding to the schema of tables within that X-Factor database, and store for each row the name of the table in the variable I've created called table name. So it's time now to see how to use that within script. What I'm going to do then is to add in a script task which will be executed for every single table found in the schema. And what it will do is write out the table name to a text file. And although that's a bit over the top as a name, it certainly does describe what it's going to do. If I then configure that, I need to pass into my script task the name of the table. And if you remember, I created the variable name on the fly, but it's been added to the collection of all the variables within this package. I can then edit my script, and as before, what I've done is put the code into the clipboard to save having to sit watching me type it out. Here's what it's going to do. It's going to use a variable called tname to hold the name of the table, this time round the loop. It's then going to write out to a text file called tables.txt the name of the table, and then close the text file. If I now close that and try executing my package, what it should be doing is creating a text file. The reason that runs slightly more slowly than you might have expected is it's not a very efficient way to do things, keeping opening and then closing the text file. If I now stop debugging, I should find that in Windows Explorer, which I think I have open here, I've got my file called tables.txt, and if I double click on that to have a look, you can see it contains lots and lots and lots of system files, and then right at the bottom the 4 tables which aren't system tables. If I'd had again a bit of foresight, it might have been a good idea to add in an additional check that the table schema was DBO before writing out the information to the text file. What I'm going to do now is to create an overview of a package to import an XML file. I could use the WiseHour website sitemap, but it's too complicated. It's got an opening line, and it's got an additional attributes for the URL set tag, all of which will stop it working. So instead, I'm going to use a tidied sitemap file where I've got rid of all those extra features, and it's just nice and simple and easy to read. The 3 nodes are URL set, URL, and then LOC. And so what I'll need to do is specify what those nodes are, and it will automatically be able to import the websites contained in the middle of it and create that as a list in a text file. So let's do that. I've already got a package called loopover_node_list. What I'm going to do is add to that a for each loop container which will loop over the nodes. What I can then do is configure that and say what sort of a loop it is. So in this case it's going to be for each node list enumerator. It's going to get its information not by typing it in, but from a file. So I need to create a new connection to that file, and because it's an existing file I'll be able to find it, and there it is on my hard disk. What I now need to do is specify the outer path string, so basically the nesting of the nodes, and this is starting with URL set. Within that I've got URL, and within that I've got LOC. My variable mappings, I'm going to create a single variable on the fly which I'll call node name, and that will tie into the first bit of information returned, and probably the only one as well. So I've now got a position where it's going to loop over all the nodes in that file. To test it out, as always, I need to add a script task within that container, so that for each node it will write it out to a text file. So I'll call my script task write out node to text file. If I then configure that, I need to pass into it the variable which I've just created, node name, which will contain each URL within the XML sitemap file. I can then specify my script, and yet again I've got the code in my clipboard, so I should just be able to paste it in there. It's going to get a variable to find out the name of this node, and then write it out a file called nodes.txt. So let's see if it works. If I choose OK to confirm that, I've set this already to be my startup package, so I should just be able to play that, and it's looking like it's worked. But as always, the proof will be, did it create the text file? That file definitely wasn't there before, and if I look at it, you can see it contains the 3 website addresses. So it worked. You can find lots more training resources on Microsoft Office, SQL Server and .NET training at www.wiseowl.co.uk.